Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 10. Chapter 75 to 81. I followed Sean inside, my stomach churning at how our last encounter had went. Sean had been upset over Kenyon, blaming me for what happened. I hadn't known it at the time, but Kenyon was partially my fault. It wasn't your fault, Lola. Sean turned, replying to my thoughts as though they were etched onto my face. Sure, the vampires want you, but they also want to destroy this pack. You couldn't have changed that. I never knew you were close with Kenyon. I frowned. We were more than just close, Lola. Sean sighed, looking twice his age as he sat on the bed. His eyes were shut, as though he were looking back in time. He was my mate. While I visibly struggled to pick my jaw up from the floor, Sean did something unexpected. An ear-splitting grin formed on his face and genuine laughter left his lips. Let's hope Dad and Grandma have the same reaction. Sean chuckled, his eyes misting over as he talked about his mate. Kenyon's parents didn't know either. We never told anyone. I wasn't sure what I liked for the longest time. I was in denial, and wouldn't admit the truth. Then Kenyon comes along and I could feel the mate bond snap into place. I couldn't hide anymore. I couldn't keep denying what I wanted. Dad and Grandma will accept you as you are. I promised him, making a mental note to rip Dad a new one if he says anything insensitive. I never knew. You could have told me. I know, Lola. Sean smiled sadly. When you left, I thought you hated me. I did nothing to stop you. I didn't even contact you half the time. Tyler made you out to be the bad guy, and like an idiot I believed him. We've all made mistakes. I nodded, not a single drop of animosity in my veins. What matters is that you're back. But Kenyon isn't. Sean frowned, his voice sounded so broken that I cringed. I think you should talk to Mason. I replied, Mason just lost his mate too. I think you two might have a lot in common, and I think talking to someone might help you. I'll try. Sean forced a smile to his face, but his eyes remained sad. Sean, I don't know what the vampires told you, but I found some things out while you were away. I grimaced, cringing at the uncertainty in my voice. I wanted to tell Sean what I had learned, how Dad wasn't my actual dad. After what Sean had just told me, I didn't want to ruin things between us. He had left angry at me, and I wasn't sure I could handle that a second time. I know, Lola. Sean frowned, but his eyes remained understanding. The other fighters talk, some of them overhear things. The vampires were looking for you, they called you half-blood. Mom's mate was a vampire. My voice came out in an irritating whisper. Wow, that explains a lot. Sean scoffed, looking oddly unaffected. We knew she left her mate for Dad. I couldn't understand how any werewolf could do that. I guess it makes sense now. You're awful understanding. I chuckled, but my face remained clouded with stress. I just told you I like men, and you were pretty understanding. Sean shrugged, much like his old self would. Thank you for that. I breathed, the stress leaving my body as a smile formed on my face. Perhaps Sean was going to be all right after all. Using one of Alpha Maddox's vehicles, I drove Sean and I back to my dad's house. The sun was beginning to settle in the sky, preparing to lower so the moon might rise. The light in the living room was on, and I knew Dad was sat in his usual recliner. Without knocking, the two of us walked into the house. Dad's eyes snapped up to where Sean and I stood, the beer tumbling from his hand as he threw himself from the recliner. Dad had never been an affectionate man. His version of praise was a smile and a slap on the back. The sight of Dad pulling Sean into his arms warmed me, and I couldn't fight the grin that formed on my face. "You," Dad grimaced, pointing a finger at me as he continued hugging Sean. "You are in so much trouble." "You're welcome." I smirked, relishing the happiness in my dad's eyes. "You did it." Grandma breathed, a smile stretching on her face as she looked Sean over. "Going to need lots of food to make up that weight. I'm sure you can manage." Sean chuckled, moving from my dad to my grandma. "Now I want the two of you to relax. Lola, come help me with dinner." Grandma murmured, turning up the TV for Sean and my dad. "Everything all right?" I frowned, setting to work as she pointed at an onion and pepper that needed chopping. "Remember what we talked about before you left to get Sean?" Grandma sighed, standing beside me to dice up some raw chicken. "Very well," I murmured. "I'm aware of your affinity with the shadows." Grandma cleared her throat, glancing at Sean and my dad to make sure they hadn't heard. "I saw you at the fight, calling to them. I'm sure you know now how dangerous that is." "I do." I frowned, something I had been wondering crossed my mind. "How come you can see them? Maddox can see them too." "It's not a special ability or anything." Grandma shrugged, her lips twitching as she registered Maddox's name in my words. "You simply have to look hard enough." "Look hard enough?" I snorted, but my heart wasn't in it. "Is that it?" "It sure is." Grandma chuckled, but her expression quickly turned serious. "I can't tell you not to mess around with them shadows, but be careful. Their prices can be steep." "I know how steep their prices are," I muttered to myself, refusing to meet her startled eyes. "Don't tell me, did you barter your life?" "No," I scoffed, "they wouldn't accept my life. They took someone else's." "Oh goddess!" Grandma shook her head, her hand against her heart. Something about Grandma's reaction flooded me with guilt, enough to bring me to my knees. Her sympathy and disappointment ate at me, hitting me harder than anything else. I didn't know. I spoke simply. Maddox was about to D*E, we were outnumbered. I had to do something. They would have KD Sean, Brianna, Mason, Carter, and Wade once I was in their grasp. The shadows can be a valuable resource, able to do things we can't. Grandma nodded, but the cost can often outweigh the benefits. Sometimes a little of your blood is payment enough, but as you well know, sometimes they ask for more. It was Mason's mate they took. I whispered, my guilt-laden eyes locked on Grandma. She rejected Mason for a vampire. I didn't know they planned on taking someone else's life. Grandma didn't say anything, knowing it would do nothing to rid the guilt from my system. Instead, she pulled me into her arms and squeezed tightly. Tears refused to spring to my eyes, as I had shed enough already. Her lavender and honey scent filled my nose, reminding me of the long days we spent in her herb garden. And even though my life was a mess, I knew everything would be all right in the end. Chapter 76. Brianna's P.O.V. My mind was reeling the entire drive back to our Pax territory. While I felt horrible for Mason and what we had just witnessed, the only thing on my mind was Giovanni. Guilt was a constant companion of mine since I had met Giovanni. I felt guilty because I couldn't tell anyone the truth, and because Giovanni was the only thing on my mind. Something had changed, he had helped us get Sean free. No, he hadn't turned his back on his kind, but this was a start. Sean will find his way to Lola, little she-wolf. I will make sure of it, but that is all I am able to do. Once those words left his lips, I knew I couldn't give up. Alpha Maddox dropped me off at my house after we rescued Sean from the club. I stood on the front steps, staring up at the dark house before me. The lights inside were off, as my parents hadn't a clue what I had done tonight. I told them the same excuse I've used multiple times, that I was staying the night at Lola's. They never questioned me, never thought to call Lola to see if I were telling the truth. My parents trusted me, and yet I continuously betrayed that trust. I used that same excuse to go to my aunt's house, to see Giovanni. It took me a total of 5 minutes and 37 seconds to decide my next move. A tugging sensation formed in my gut, like a tether pulling me forward. My body reacted on its own accord, fishing my car keys from my purse and darting over to the driveway. The leather seats of my car were cool against my thighs, but I hardly noticed. My hands trembled against the steering wheel at the thought of seeing him again. The entire drive that incessant tugging sensation grew, increasing my nerves and underlying excitement. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I refused to have the same ending as Mason and Adrian. I refused to watch him take his last breath because he was on the wrong side of this war. As selfish as it sounded, I didn't care who he would be leaving behind by choosing our side. It was an innate instinct to keep him alive, and how far I was willing to go for him terrified me to my core. I pulled into the driveway of my aunt's house, letting out a ragged breath as I noticed a single light on within the house. The ground was slick from previous rain, the pleasant scent of damp earth swirled around the house. Water dripped from the roof of the house, hitting the ground in time with my thundering heart. My eyes found his instantly the moment I walked into the house. His dark curls were shining, as though he had gotten caught in the rain. Little droplets stood out on his dark jacket, the rain making his mouth-watering scent stronger. Something seemed to shift inside him at the sight of me. The intense guard that kept his emotions in place shattered as he lurched forward. Despite the chill in the house and his damp clothes, his hands seared my skin through the dress I wore. After a single touch from him, I was no longer cold. A blistering fire surrounded me, emanating from Giovanni. His lips clashed against my own, soft and plush as we met hungrily. A deep noise sounded from his throat as I threaded my fingers through his curly hair. I had spent many days wondering what his curls would feel like beneath my fingers. I held his lips against my own, relishing in the taste of his skin. Pure male musk mixed with something sweet, awakening my taste buds and setting every nerve on fire. Sparks devoured every inch of my skin, connecting the two of us in more ways than one. Two warring species, and yet this was our moment of peace, just a single moment where our family and friends weren't able to dictate the choices we made. A single moment where the two of us were able to love freely, away from the prying eyes of our pack and family. His arms remained wrapped tightly around my waist as our lips pulled apart. Fear and hurt settled in my bones as I prepared for Giovanni to walk away for the third time. Instead of walking away, his grip tightened around me. His deep eyes met my own, and the turmoil I saw within them sent a flash of pain through me. When I heard his voice was thick, tinged with the slight accent he sometimes had. When I heard Tristan sent vampires after you, I thought you were DD. We got away, but we had to kill them all. I frowned at how weak my voice sounded, at the lingering fear that circled my words. I was afraid he would hear how we KD his kind and abandon me once and for all. I thought I was strong, that I could handle rejecting my vampire mate. As I looked into the depth of his eyes, I saw how weak I truly was. I could see what rejecting him would do to me. I wasn't as strong as Mason or Lola. I wasn't sure I'd be able to survive losing Giovanni. I don't care about them. Giovanni snarled, but his words held a certain weight to them. Words that once spoken, could never be taken back. I care about you, Brianna. I wasn't sure who made the first move, him or I. Our lips found each other's with newfound vengeance. I could taste the frustration on his tongue as it glided silkily against my own. I could feel the longing in his hands as he gripped at the thin fabric of my dress. Our hands trailed the length of each other, roaming over creamy skin, committing the feel to memory. Brianna, he forced himself away, and I realized he had been grazing the skin underneath my dress. It wasn't that burned in his eyes, it was a longing so severe it nearly brought me to my knees. A dark craving for affection and love burned in his eyes, a craving he continuously fought whenever I was around. I'm not sorry, Giovanni. I breathed, trying to hear past my thundering heartbeat. I'm not sorry for wanting you to change sides, for knowing you're better than the vampires you pledge your loyalty to. I'm not sorry for knowing you deserve so much more. For a second, I thought he would turn away from me, and leave me broken-hearted yet again. Instead of turning away, he stepped closer. He was teetering on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to save himself or to enjoy the blood-rushing fall. Without hesitation, I threw myself from the cliff and enjoyed every moment of the fall. I wanted him, more than I had ever wanted anything. My soul called out to his own, begged him to join me in the fall. I'm not sorry that I want you. The all-consuming sparks raced across my skin as Giovanni lifted me into his arms, darting down the hall and into the first room that had a bed. His lips never left my own, his hands never stopped roaming my body. As the thin quilt on the bed met my back, I looked up into Giovanni's eyes and nearly gasped at the wonder and awe burning within them. His hands clasped my waist lightly, as though he were afraid I'd crumble into dust under his touch. Say it again. I want you, Giovanni. I exhaled, relishing in the feel of his thundering heart against my own. I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the weakness this strong vampire carried within him. Every emotion he longed to experience was locked away, and I was the key. His lips took their time tasting my skin, roaming over every creamy ounce until he had his fill. With each breathless gasp that left my lips, his hunger seemed to intensify. I cleared my mind, refusing to let myself think of anything other than what was happening within these walls. Nothing else mattered, nothing but the man who held half of my soul. Neither of us needed to ask as we shed the clothes restricting us. We both had leaped from the cliff, determined to enjoy the free fall until we met the unforgiving ground. I hadn't heard the tear of my dress as he ripped it from my body, nor did I feel the cool breeze graze against my skin. My panties were the last to go, as I hadn't worn a bra with my form-fitting dress. My skin was on fire under Giovanni's touch, warming me in ways I had only dreamed of experiencing. As Giovanni's clothes fell to the floor, I took in the wondrous man before me. Bronzed skin and dark curly hair, a jawline made purely of sharp edges, and a chiseled chest with a light spattering of dark hair. Mouth-wateringly beautiful, and all mine. From the unspoken awe in Giovanni's eyes, he too was thinking the same thing. His eyes devoured every inch of my skin, his lips trailed down my skin, taking my hardened nip in his mouth with a blissful groan. My body reacted under his touch, relishing the hands and mouth that had been made to love and please us. I want to taste you. He murmured softly, his large hands grazing against my inner thighs. His dark eyes searched my own, looking for any trace of hesitance or regret. When he had found none, his tongue darted out and met my sensitive flesh. My blissful whimpers encouraged him, and he lapped hungrily at my dampened folds. Pleasureful sparks mixed with pure ecstasy, and I found myself coming undone under his skillful tongue. After the waves of pure bliss had finally ended, his lips found my own. I moaned against his lips, savoring the taste of myself on his tongue. I don't care what you are. You're mine, Giovanni. As Giovanni took my body for his own, I couldn't tell where I began and where he ended. A mess of tangled limbs, sweat, and blissful moans. His brilliant eyes had never left my own, unable to hold back the torrent of emotion he suppressed. His husky moans filled my ear. That's it. He purred lowly in my ear, come for me. My nails dug painfully into his soft skin, my back arching as pleasure spanned my body and clouded my mind. I wrapped my arms around his torso. I wanted to leave the world behind us, to hide within these walls and live out this fantasy. Once we left this house, I wasn't sure I could handle letting him go. Something had changed within his eyes, something I thought was simply due to. For a moment, I swore I could see his past within those dark eyes. A young boy, born for one purpose, forced to set his own passions and desires aside for duty. He didn't fight me as I clung to his smooth body, instead he rolled to the side and pulled me against his chest. I'm afraid after this, I do not want to leave. I could hear how difficult it was for him to speak those words, and what they truly meant to him. Then don't. My mind was made up. I refused to let Giovanni go, I couldn't. Stay with me, Giovanni. Chapter 77. Lola's P.O.V. Eating dinner with my family brought back some normalcy into my life, but I couldn't ignore the empty chair where my mom used to sit. I wondered if she was looking down on me, watching as I discovered what I was. Would she be proud to see me resisting Tristan? Or disappointed that I wanted to reject half of myself? After dinner, Sean and Dad retreated to the couch, watching sports as they once had before this mess started. Dad couldn't see it, but I could. I could see how much Sean had changed. Even with a smile on his face, the light had left his eyes. While I could never understand the feeling of losing your mate, I hoped he found happiness in his life. After helping Grandma clean up the kitchen, they motioned for me to follow her outside. Standing on the back patio, I looked over to where my bedroom window sat. I could still see Kenyon's lifeless eyes staring into my window, his scarlet blood staining the grass. I wondered if I were to look close enough, would there still be little droplets of blood on the grass? I'm not using the shadows again, I assured Grandma, grimacing as I stared out into the forest. There used to be something reassuring about the dense forest that surrounded our little town, but now it filled me with unease. There could be anyone out there, watching and waiting. I don't think you should ignore that side of yourself, Lola. Grandma frowned, as though the words pained her. The shadows are not an inherently evil force, they're actually neutral. Neutral? I scoffed, slitting someone's throat doesn't sound very neutral to me. A life for a life. Grandma sighed, looking much older in that moment. You can't expect things for free, Lola. Sometimes they'll want blood, sometimes they can be creative. Creative? That sounds reassuring. I grimaced. How do you know all of this anyway? You know more about vampires than the history books. Your mom moved here when she was young, after she met the vampire king. She hadn't a clue he was a king, or that he was the heir of the Curitis bloodline. She rejected him before fleeing from her little town, hoping he wouldn't dare hunt her down. Grandma sighed. I became close friends with your other grandma, and eventually your mom. Your other grandma and I, well, we were the only two your mom told. Then how did Dad know? I asked, my attention captivated because I was finally getting the answers I craved. They too became close friends over time. It had been a couple years since she moved to this pack, but one day she went outside of the territory. The Vampire King had found her within the hour. Grandma paused, shuddering as she relived the memory but continued. He toyed with her, let her live in safety for a couple years. He could have gotten to her at any time, should he use the shadows. Something you need to know about your true father, there is not a price he wouldn't pay for power. That makes him dangerous. I had figured as much, but hearing the words out loud sent a chill down my spine. I had no doubt the Vampire King would remove his own child if it helped his cause. Your mom was a half-blood too, only her other half was human. She was the one who figured out how to block her mind, and she passed the information on to me. Grandma smiled grimly. The Vampire King needed a way to produce an heir, so he called to the shadows. He could have chosen another woman, but your mom would give him the strongest offspring. What price did he pay? I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. Complete control of the mind is quite the favor. Grandma's smile dropped. They asked for someone in her bloodline, someone who loved unconditionally, and they wanted him to do the job himself. It was your other grandma they wanted. Buttery light from the setting sun bounced across the forest and grassy floor, a beautiful sight in the midst of a grim conversation. The unspoken words lingered between us, their meaning loud and clear. The Vampire King had gotten what he wanted, as I was proof of that. He had taken my other grandma's life with his hands, paying his debt to the shadows. I always thought you didn't like Mom. I chuckled dryly, remembering the countless angry looks and sideways glares. I always liked your mom. Grandma scoffed, waving me away. I just hated how hard she was on herself. She loved you, but blamed herself for her mom's DH. Grandma and I went back inside once the sun had completely vanished behind the forest line, carrying that buttery light further away. After giving me more leftovers than I needed, Dad dropped me off at the pack house. As I scurried into the kitchen I locked eyes with Alpha Maddox, who leaned against the counter enduring a conversation with Alpha Bran. I hadn't seen the sandy-haired Alpha since I had beaten him in the fight, and from the grim smile on his face, I knew he remembered that night very well. Room will be made for when your men arrive. Alpha Maddox grunted, an irritated look of indifference on his face. With a dark sweatshirt draped against his form, my eyes found the dip and curve of his arm muscles easily. My eyes trailed up his broad shoulders, and chiseled jawline to meet his darkening eyes. As he noticed my attention, a sly smirk formed on his face. Sensing Alpha Maddox's attention was elsewhere, Alpha Bran flashed me a transparent smile. I'm sure that you'll see them taken care of. Alpha Bran smiled stiffly before turning leave. It seems he's taking his loss rather hard. Alpha Maddox smirked, the curve of his lips warming my insides. His men haven't arrived yet? I asked, an amused glance in the direction Alpha Bran stalked off in. He has had issues gathering his forces. Alpha Maddox grunted, wasting as much time as he can. Are we sure Alpha Bran isn't working with the vampires? I snorted, procrastinating could be to their benefit. Alpha Bran isn't stupid enough to work with the vampires. His family has hated them for decades. Alpha Maddox shook his head, he'd forfeit his position as Alpha to see them all KD off. And what about patrol? Brittany said an AK could happen at any point. I questioned, ignoring my flinch at his previous statement. Alpha Zeke brought what men he could afford, we have them stationed around along the southern perimeter. How do we know they haven't changed plans? I frowned, they have to know we have Brittany by now. She says they are unaware of the information she has on them. Alpha Maddox said simply. I'm sure you're still taking precautions. I replied. Of course. He smirked, trusting her word alone could mean the DTH of this pack. As for patrol tonight, I meant to tell you earlier, but you are relieved of patrol duties for the foreseeable future. Really? I questioned, eyebrow raised. I wasn't complaining, but everyone in training was required to run patrol. Really? He chuckled lowly, his eyes flashing playfully. Actually, I'd like for you to accompany me tonight. If you aren't busy. Well, I was going to run patrol. I smirked, but I was sure he could hear my accelerating heart rate. It seems I have some free time, now that I've been relieved. Change into something comfortable, I'll wait down here. Alpha Maddox smiled, one that softened his face and smoothed the hardness from his eyes. I ran up the stairs and into our bedroom, stripping off the clothes I had worn today in exchange for the dress Brianna let me borrow. While the black fabric covered my important bits, it was on the shorter side. Just to be safe, I slipped on a matching pair of shorts. Alpha Maddox hadn't moved as I slipped back downstairs. His toffee eyes roamed me, approval flashing in his gaze. Under his eyes I felt self-conscious, my skin flushed and heated. You look good in black. Alpha Maddox nodded, appreciatively. His large hand tugged at the hem of my dress, a smirk forming on his face. I particularly like this dress. I wonder why. I snorted, though blush formed across my face. No need to rub Alpha Brand's loss in his face. Alpha Maddox smirked, his thick arm snaking around my waist as he led me to the back door. Where are we going? I frowned, following him to the forest line. Isn't there going to be an AK any day? We aren't going far. He assured me, I have men roaming the forest, and some stationed around the house. I had never fully explored the woods around our pack before. I had followed Tyler to the swimming hole countless times, but never ventured out on my own. Tyler had refused to let me train or join patrol, claiming my status as future Luna put me above everyone else. Alpha Maddox led me into the woods, holding back branches and leaves as I trailed beside him. His hand found my own, our fingers threading together. Alpha Maddox had never made me feel below him. I had voiced my opinion to him a few times now, and each time he listened. I didn't feel as though I were following my Alpha into the woods. I was following the guy I loved, one who cherished my body and enjoyed my opinions. Where are we going? I asked, breaking the comfortable silence between us. You'll see. Alpha Maddox gave me a genuine smile, one that left me staggering for breath. I enjoy time alone, and had found this place shortly after taking over the pack. We walked into a small clearing, as big as our bedroom in the pack house. Small flowers were scattered throughout the clearing, growing in white clumps. The petals were thin, but seemed to absorb the moonlight shining overhead. The white petals appeared to be glowing as they attracted the light of the moon. I believe the previous Luna had planted these. Alpha Maddox murmured, I never asked. She loves gardening, but I never knew about this. I nodded, my attention on the luminescent flowers that dotted the clearing. It's so beautiful. My stomach was a mess of knots as I felt the presence of the man behind me, gauging my reaction as I looked over the flowers. He had brought me here, a place he went to be alone. There were times I doubted his feelings towards me, but this had to mean something. Where I usually had courage, something about Alpha Maddox brought me to my knees. I wanted to turn around, confess my feelings for him and demand to know if he felt the same. Instead of doing any of those things, I turned around and gave him a gentle smirk. I wouldn't have thought you'd like something like this. I chuckled lightly, my heart speeding up as he closed the distance between us. I am allowed to appreciate beauty when I see it. Alpha Maddox smirked down at me, his dark eyes smoldering as he took in my face. My heart thundered at the meaning of his words. I ran my tongue along my lower lip, coating the soft flesh with moisture as butterflies swarmed in my stomach. His eyes caught the movement, following the trail of my tongue with burning intensity. His breath fanned against my lips, hovering just above my own. My self-control was holding by a frayed thread. Just as a low growl sounded from his throat, I began to close the distance between us. Alpha, there's been a breach on the northern side of town, a group of vampires. Patrol was able to take 3 down, but 4 slipped through. Brianna's mom saw them running down her street. It seems like they're looking for something. The words echoed between Alpha Maddox and I, the moment between us shattered violently. Dad's house is on Brianna's street. I croaked. Tell everyone to keep indoors. Send a patrol team to Lola's house, we're on our way. What if they don't know I moved into the pack house? Dad and Grandma are there. Chapter 78. They're going to be expecting you. Alpha Maddox frowned, but I had already made up my mind. With Alpha Maddox's hand in my own, we fled from the forest and back to the pack house. Rather than shed our clothes and shift into wolf form, we hopped into one of Maddox's vehicles and sped towards my dad's house. Remind me to KL Alpha Bran and take his pack for my own once we're finished. Alpha Maddox growled, his eyes dark and murderous as we sped down the narrow town roads. Alpha Bran? I questioned. If he wasn't content on being nuisance, his men would have been here by now. Alpha Maddox snarled, we would have outnumbered them easily. We can win against them, can't we? I asked, trying to keep the fear from warping my voice. I can't speak for the vampires' training, but I'm confident in my pack. Alpha Maddox's words held a certain conviction that filled me with strength. He was so sure of his pack, of their ability to handle this threat. Just when we were a minute away, Mason's voice filtered through our heads, making my blood run cold. Alpha, we had to retreat back to the borders. More vampires showed, they're forcing us back, trying to find a hole in our defenses. They're attacking from the northern side of town while another group is attacking from the southern side. It's a distraction, we know that, but we can't afford any more warriors. I need all warriors, anyone capable of fighting, to head to the northern or southern patrol stations. Those of you in your homes, I would not ask if I had an alternative. Those of you able to fight, uninjured from past battles, head to the northern or southern patrol stations. Make them regret with our pack. Alpha Maddox snarled through the mind link, his eyes hardening and hands tightening over the steering wheel. Alpha Maddox's voice was that of a leader, strong and reassuring in the midst of chaos. His words stirred something within me, something that made me want to stand up and fight. We won't let them hurt our family. Maya snarled, affected by Alpha Maddox's words. You have a plan for this, right? I gasped, my mind racing as I thought of Sean, Dad, and Grandma. I could only hope the vampires had passed Brianna's house, leaving her behind in their search for me. Of course. Alpha Maddox grunted, I had many of my warriors from other cities travel here, some of the best are on their way. From what I heard, they were ahead of schedule. Brittany, I started, but Alpha Maddox cut me off with a low growl. I will deal with her when this mess is sorted. She might not have known. They could have let the information slip, knowing she'd plan on escaping. I rushed out, my eyes narrowing as we drew closer to the house. They could have planned all of this for the upper hand. Or Brittany could be a spy. Alpha Maddox snapped. She could. I agreed, but, we need to hear her out first. Standing out front of the house were 6 figures, 4 dressed in dark clothing, their postures rigid and tense. My hammering heart dropped to my stomach as I was able to make out the grim faces of Sean and Brianna. The lights inside the house were on, and from a distance I could make out my dad and grandma's worried faces as they peeked out the living room window. I knew Dad was itching to go outside and defend his son, and I prayed to the moon goddess that he would stay put. Dad had shattered his knee many years ago, and while it had healed, it still gave him trouble time to time. Grandma had a will of fire and obsidian, a force to be reckoned with, but even she remained inside, most likely to keep my dad from throwing himself out the door. Both Sean and Brianna were standing their ground against 4 vampires. In the hands of the vampires, they held something that reflected the dull light of the street lamps. The vampires had come prepared this time, sporting knives coated in silver. Sean was fighting against 2 of the vampires, but his movements were slower than usual. I watched as pain flashed across his face, and my eyes were drawn low, to the crimson liquid leaking down his T*H. If Sean was stabbed by one of the vampires, his wolf was now suppressed, leaving only his strength and speed. A flash of blonde hair lighter than I had seen on a human came into view. Those eyes, Tristan's eyes, met my own as a smile fluttered onto his face. Brianna fought against the vampires with a ferocity I had never seen before, her face clouded with emotion as a thin line of blood trickled down her scalp. From behind, 5 more vampires stalked under the dim street light, their eyes set on Brianna and Sean. Undoubtedly, they slipped through the patrol line, avoiding the fight around our town. Tristan stood back from the fight, surveying everything with a serpentine smile on his face. I was revolted at the sight of him, wondering how I could have ever felt attracted to such a monster. The scarlet mark tingled against my skin, as if it were scolding me for such thoughts. "I'm going to kill him," Alpha Maddox snarled, jerking the car onto the side of the road. The 2 of us leaped from the car, running over to Brianna and Sean. Alpha Maddox tackled one of the vampires from behind, knocking him off Sean. With a swift movement, Maddox's claws lengthened and raked across the vampire's throat. Thick blood sprayed across his face, the metallic scent filling the air. I leaped at one of the vampires, ducking as he swung the knife at my face. Time seemed to slow, and I met my reflection in the blade's smooth surface as it whizzed past my face. "Do not harm Lola," Tristan snarled at the vampires who continued fighting for their lives. The vampire fighting against me listened to Tristan's words, and worked to restrain me. With the vampire's body close to my own, it was easy to twist and maneuver until my lengthened canines sunk into his neck. The feeling was oddly satisfying, like sinking your teeth into a stick of butter. Recoiling at the taste, I spat a piece of his throat into the road and watched as he fell to his knees. In the midst of the fighting, something had changed. Sean no longer had the upper hand against the vampires and collapsed to the ground as the leather hilt of a knife protruded from his abdomen. Brianna lunged to protect Sean, but was still standing her ground against 2 other vampires. My head snapped around as the front door to the house slammed open, and Dad came barreling down the steps. Grandma stood in the open doorway, her hand against her heart and a look of terror on her face. "Dad!" I screamed, every nerve in my body bursting aflame. "Don't!" My body moved on its own, propelling myself forward until I collided with the vampire stalking towards Sean. Maya's strength flowed into my body, dulling the sensations in my limbs. My claws and canines lengthened on their own as I swiped at the vampire in feral rage. Snarls and growls echoed across the quiet street, and I had realized those primal sounds were leaving my lips. Dad wrapped his arms around Sean's torso, glaring murderous daggers at the remaining vampires. Making use of his time, Dad dragged Sean up the curb and onto the porch steps. I had but a moment to watch as Grandma stepped outside and helped, pulling Sean into the house. Something hot and sticky ran down my face, the smell of copper in my nose. The vampire beneath me was a mass of torn flesh and muscle. His face was no longer distinguishable, though I knew he was handsome when alive. I leaped from the vampire's body, ready to move on to the next when a sharp pain racked my torso. There was a tear in the dress Brianna had given me, around 3 inches long. Protruding from the hole was the leather hilt of a knife, a single ruby embedded into the handle. Tristan met my eyes, filling his murderous gaze. Alpha Maddox whipped around, as though my pain had physically affected him. While the two of them gaped at the knife protruding from my stomach, my eyes were on Brianna. She was fighting against 2 vampires, the fight in her eyes was flickering, DG out as though it had been doused with cool water. Another vampire stalked forward, landing a blow to her back that sent her to her knees. Our eyes locked, and in them I could hear the words that refused to leave her lips. "I'm sorry, stop!" A voice bellowed, one I hadn't heard before. The vampires seemed to notice the voice, as they all froze, their eyes locked on the figure that walked forward. Dark curly hair sat on top his head, with blackened eyes that seemed to peer into the darkness around us. Realization hit me, followed by confusion. This was the vampire I had seen in the clearing, the one that had gotten away with Tristan. Tristan had told me his name, Giovanni. My stomach twisted itself into knots as Brianna turned and met his eyes, a strange emotion crossing her face as their gazes met. "Love Giovanni." Tristan's voice held the confusion that burned in my eyes. As he took a step forward, Giovanni's gaze hardened. "Do not come closer, Tristan," Giovanni warned, his voice hard as a light accent curled his words. He approached Brianna's form, clasping a hand around her arm as he pulled her back. "Get off of her!" I called out, but quickly realized the error of my words as Giovanni turned to face me. "I will not hurt her, Lola," Giovanni murmured, his voice soft as it hit my ears. "I will never hurt her." Brianna looked into his eyes, a look I had seen only a handful of times. All at once, every word and action Brianna had made burned into my mind. Her gloomy mood, the questions about vampires and mates, her sudden desire to research vampires. His name, she had told me the name of her mate. Giovanni, what is this?" Tristan spat, his icy eyes hardening as he took in the close proximity between him and Brianna. "I have found my mate, Tristan." Giovanni's voice held strength and conviction, emotions difficult to falsify. "It is time you leave Lola alone, and allow her to find her own." The words seemed to physically wound Tristan as his smooth face quickly became grim and pale with anger. 2 things happened simultaneously. Tristan lunged forward, with speed I had never anticipated, slamming into Giovanni. Giovanni had managed to shove Brianna behind him, and I watched as her bottom hit the pavement. "Lola, get Brianna!" Alpha Maddox snarled, fighting off the 4 remaining vampires himself, struggling to stand his ground. "Get her inside the house!" "No," Brianna snapped, pushing herself from the pavement. "I'm not leaving him." I watched in stunned silence as Brianna's bones snapped sickeningly, and fur sprouted from her body. Her clothes tore into small scraps, falling to the pavement like confetti. With deafening snarl, she tackled one of the vampires fighting Alpha Maddox. Tristan and Giovanni circled each other, their faces dark and unyielding. Blood coated Giovanni's face, and I wondered if it were Tristan's or his own. Without enough time to think, I lunged at one of the remaining vampires. I knew Maddox would be pissed with me later on, but I refused to leave him as well. The vampire fought defensively, trying to restrain my hands and shove me away. A snarl ripped through my throat as he slammed his hand into the hilt of the knife in my stomach, digging it further into my flesh. The sharp scent of my blood filled the air, but I let the scent and my anger fuel me. I wrapped my hand around the hilt of the blade, pulling it from my stomach with a painful hiss. Agony radiated throughout my body, blurring my vision. I barreled into the vampire, gritting my teeth against the pain. The blade sunk into his chest with a sickening thud, growing beads of blood seeping through his shirt. I stumbled back and watched as the fight quickly came to an end. Brianna had KD another vampire, and Alpha Maddox was pressing forward against the last. Giovanni seemed to have the upper hand, slamming his shoulder into Tristan's chest, nearly knocking them both to the ground. Giovanni had been a moment too late as he registered the knife in Tristan's hand. Tristan used his surprise against him, sending him stepping back with a slash of the knife. A scream tore through Brianna as Tristan lunged with dangerous accuracy, sinking the wide blade into Giovanni's chest. Brianna tore past Tristan, his presence ignored as she clambered to Giovanni. My eyes were set on Tristan, who stepped away from Giovanni with a grim smile on his face. Never had I expected you to change sides. Of all people, Giovanni, your DH disappoints me the most. Icy prickles danced across my skin, settling in my bones with sickening familiarity. Shadows danced from the forest line, gathering behind Tristan like a looming cloud. They glided over to Tristan, wrapping around him in a shimmering cocoon. A few tendrils circled around my feet, as if they were greeting a friend. Nearly a second later, the shadows around him thinned, and Tristan was gone. The street was silent apart from Brianna's gut-wrenching cries. I stumbled over to her, kneeling beside her. Her face was rigid, grim lines etched onto her face. Even without my heightened senses, I could tell Giovanni was DG. The knife had been torn from his chest, leaving a gaping wound behind. His blood flowed steadily, absorbed by his dark t-shirt. "Save him, Lola!" Brianna hissed so quietly, I nearly missed her words. "Brianna, the price is too steep," I croaked, pain constricting in my chest. "I don't care. I'll pay it." Brianna turned her eyes to me, anger burning in her gaze. "I'll pay anything." "Do it, Lola." Even with my muddled thinking, I knew what I would do. I had watched the life drain from Adrian, and saw the sorrow in Mason's eyes as he accepted her rejection. I wouldn't allow Brianna to go through the same. If the price was someone's life, I was terrified of what she might do. "Don't." Alpha Maddox spoke, but I had made up my mind. The shadows that had lingered surged at the sound of my voice, their icy licks caressing my skin. Their smooth voices filled my mind, greeting an old friend who had called on them yet again. "Save Giovanni," I told them. "Name your price." Their silky voices wrapped around my head, the price of their favor burned into my mind. Brianna's eyes widened as she looked at the empty space around me, where the shadows pulsed seductively. "She'll pay it," I whispered. "Now save him." The shadows seemed to twitch in anticipation, gliding towards Brianna excitedly. While fear flashed in her eyes, she remained still. Her scream echoed into the night, bouncing off houses filled with people listening to the battle outside. Chapter 79. The blood that coated my stomach and hands was warm in comparison to the shadow's ice-coated words. Maya recoiled at their price, her hackles raised as an ear-splitting growl reverberated throughout my mind. Brianna was still crouched over Giovanni, her eyes burning madly as she watched the shadows pulse around my body. They had asked the unthinkable, and Brianna had agreed blindly. "Our price is this," they hissed seductively in my ear. "To save the vampire she calls mate, we ask for the form of her wolf." She'll pay it, I whispered, meeting Brianna's burning gaze. Now save him. The shadows pulsed around my body, slithering between my legs as they raced towards Brianna. What was the price? Brianna whimpered, her body unnaturally still as the shadows glided around her body. Your wolf form, I croaked. Pain racked through my body, but it wasn't originating from the wound in my stomach. The pain coursing through me was for my friend and what she was willing to give up for her mate. Her wolf would remain in her mind, trapped in a flesh. Unable to shift and roam the earth, unable to feel the dirt beneath her paws. Brianna had made the ultimate sacrifice for Giovanni, and I prayed he was willing to do the same. They're taking my wolf. Her voice was small, smaller than I had ever heard it before. Brianna's voice was paper-thin glass, transparent as fear bled into her eyes. She'll still be there within you. My voice cracked as I struggled to force the words from my mouth. But you won't be able to shift anymore. That's their price. Realization dawned in her eyes as one of the shadows surged forward, latching onto Brianna's chest. I was rooted in place as a gut-wrenching scream tore from Brianna's mouth, cracking as her vocal cords struggled from the pressure. After just a few moments, the screaming died down, turning into a heartbroken whimper. Everything within me erupted into agony at the sight of her face, and for a moment I wished I had been the one to pay the price. One by one the shadows glided away from Brianna and over to Giovanni. The blood coating his body was thick and had a sweet smell to it. I knew without the shadows, Brianna's mate would be all but lost. The shadows caressed Giovanni's body, and Brianna's eyes widened as the shadows' voices spilled into the air. I could hear the sharp breath of Maddox, and knew he could hear them as well. Remove the knife from his chest, she-wolf. They hissed, their silky movements becoming still as they waited impatiently. Brianna grasped the handle of the knife tightly, unresponsive as the silver coating seared her skin. Giovanni let out a grunt as the knife slipped from his chest and clattered to the pavement. She tore away the ripped shirt that covered his chest, exposing a smooth plane of bronze-colored skin. The shadows had wasted little time, gliding over Giovanni's body to the wound that sat just above his heart. I watched in painful silence as the threads of his flesh formed together, muscle connecting to muscle, and his lifeblood running dry. The shadows slithered away from his body, wrapping once around my ankles as though they were parting me goodbye. The street was silent, the only noise coming from Giovanni's chest. A dull thud that grew stronger, faster, as the wounds within his body healed. When his eyes fluttered open, a sob tore from Brianna's chest. She threw herself into Giovanni's arms, her body shaking as his arms around her body. Giovanni's dark eyes met my own, and for a moment, I swore there was a message deep within his intrusive gaze. Maddox was at my side in seconds, his hands shaking as they peeled away the bottom layer of my dress. Blood had soaked into the black fabric, staining his skin as his hands roamed my stomach. "I'm fine, Maddox," I hissed, my eyes remained on my best friend. "You were stabbed, Lola." Maddox met my eyes with murderous intensity, his hands trembling as they brushed across my skin. Maddox shot a hard look at Giovanni and Brianna. "Stay where you are. I have nowhere else to go." I could see a flash of surprise in Maddox's gaze at Giovanni's unexpected response, followed by suspicion. "Where is the wound, Lola?" Maddox's voice was hard, guarded as his hands ran over the smooth skin of my abdomen. "I'll explain later," I whispered, and met Giovanni's gaze. He was listening to our entire conversation, and while Brianna seemed to trust him, I remained on guard. Maddox's eyes were burning with emotion, each flashing in his gaze faster than I could process. His rough hand remained on my stomach, where the stab wound had once been. You would betray your own kind for her. Maddox turned away from me, shooting me one last glance before placing his attention on Giovanni. Maddox's voice swelled, feral dominance filling his voice as he stepped into the position of alpha. His honey eyes were darkening, heavy flecks of gold swirling in his gaze. Giovanni met his stare unflinchingly, his arms never once wavering from Brianna's shaking form. Yes. Giovanni answered, and I noted there was no hesitation in his voice. Yes, I would. And what is it you expect now? Maddox questioned harshly, though there was no malice in his words. A place in the pack? You would join a community that holds nothing but hatred for your kind. So long as Brianna remains, then yes. Giovanni nodded, his arms tightening around Brianna. I noted the way she looked up at him, comfort and love blazing in her hazel eyes. Something had dawned on me at the sight of them together. Brianna had been with him before, had met up with him in the past. I hadn't a clue where or how, but love like that is not instantaneous. The way she looked at him struck something within me, and I found myself wondering how different vampires truly were to werewolves. Maddox was right, this town harbored much animosity towards vampires, and for a good reason, but they hadn't a clue about my true heritage. Would my own pack reject me if they knew what I was? Maddox. I whispered through the mind link, even though no one could hear us. His eyes remained on Giovanni, but his voice filtered through my head. What? Do you trust me? I asked, and this time his eyes found my own. Confusion lingered in his eyes, but I could see in his gaze that he trusted me fully. I do. He responded. Give Giovanni a chance. I spoke quickly, leaving him no time to interrupt. Question him, keep him away from the pack, but do not tear him and Brianna apart. You are supporting this. His voice was laced with anger, though not directed towards me. You would have this pack harbor a vampire, knowing the deaths and attacks we've suffered. I am half vampire, Maddox. I forced strength into my words, and realized this was the first time I had admitted the truth to someone other than myself or Maya. It is not right to allow me to remain here, while casting Giovanni out. You are also half werewolf, Lola. Maddox responded, his tone hard. Giovanni has been directly involved with the deaths and attacks on this pack. For all we know, he could have helped take Sean. I understand that. I replied, my voice cracking at the thought of my dad dragging a wounded Sean into the house. He is Brianna's mate for a reason, Maddox. I think things are changing. I think vampires and werewolves have been separate for far too long. I could feel the reluctance seeping from Maddox's pores as we locked eyes, but I could also see the unwavering trust he held for me. The emotion was strong enough to bring tears to my eyes, to which Maddox's eyes softened. If it were up to me, you would be executed come morning. Maddox turned to Giovanni, his voice lowering into a rough growl. At Maddox's words, Brianna's eyes snapped up. Lola has convinced me otherwise. She has convinced me you deserve a chance. Two sets of eyes met my own, Brianna's and Giovanni's. Each burned with gratitude, but Giovanni's was laced with surprise. Brianna had once told me you would accept me. Giovanni's light accent curled around his words. I did not believe her at the time. I hope I am able to live up to your expectations. Oh, you will. Maddox nodded darkly, the blood of an alpha coursing through his veins. Your existence will not be revealed to this pack, not yet. They will not take kindly to your presence here. There is a house on the outskirts of my territory, head there now and remain unseen. I will come to question you when this mess is fully sorted. I would expect nothing less, Alpha Maddox. Yet, I thank you for your hospitality. Giovanni nodded, his face oddly serene as he looked down at Brianna. It's not me you should thank. Alpha Maddox grunted, thank Lola, without her you would be DD. Thank you, Lola. Giovanni nodded, keeping his intense gaze on my face. Gently, Giovanni stood and pulled Brianna into his arms. Her hazel eyes were wide and bloodshot as they burned into my face. I watched as her lips parted and moved silently, unable to force the words from her lips. I'll tell your mom you decided to stay with me. I promised her, I'll tell her you're all right. The edges of her lips pulled up in a small smile, but I could see the shattered pieces of her heart slicing into her skin. I could see the pain of Brianna and her wolf lingering in those hazel eyes, celebrating their mate but mourning their loss. With Brianna in his arms, Giovanni darted down the road, his body becoming blurred from the speed. Sean! I choked, stumbling towards my house. The vampires' corpses sat in the middle of the road, the scent of their thick blood lodged in my nose. Maddox was beside me in an instant, his rough hand under my arm as he led me up the porch stairs. Lying on the floor was Sean, much paler than usual, with Dad hovering over him. Dad's face was rigid, the lines on his face appearing deeper and much more drawn out. Grandma flitted from the backyard to the kitchen, and finally back to Sean. She placed a wet rag against his stomach, pressing firmly as she looked between the two of us. Her dark hair was streaked with grey, pulled up in a bun as her face contorted in concentration. Her eyes widened as she took in Maddox and I standing there. I was sure the two of us looked horrible. I could feel the sticky blood drying to my skin, flaking and peeling off with every move I made. The short dress I was wearing was torn, revealing my blood-coated stomach and dark shorts. I put herbs on the wound. Grandma's words were clipped as she focused on Sean. It'll help dissolve the silver in his blood, but he needs a doctor. One is on their way. Maddox nodded, his face hard as he looked down at Sean. The doctors at the hospital will be quite busy, so I called for my personal doctor. The patrol teams. I choked, my heart rate speeding as I remembered the fight occurring around our town. When Tristan vanished, the rest of the vampires retreated. Maddox grimaced, his tone filled with fury as he spoke Tristan's name. Even with the horrendous scarlet mark on my skin, my stomach turned sour at the sound of Tristan's name. We remained with my grandma and dad until Maddox's personal doctor arrived. Only when I was sure Sean would survive, did we finally leave the house. As guilty as I felt over Sean's injury and Brianna's loss, my mind was overflowing with questions and sick realizations. My father had used the shadows to save Tristan, which meant a price was to be paid. What had my father paid for Tristan's escape? Alpha Maddox and I got back into the car we left on the side of the road. Some of his men had already arrived, removing the bodies and blood from the road. Maddox had told me Alpha Zeke fought on the northern side of town, mowing down vampires as fast as he could. Zeke had brought Bran with him, who KD the vampires with equal ferocity. Luna Freya had remained at the pack house, but sent her men to aid in the fight. The silence in the car allowed me too much time to think. Either Brittany had been wrong, or she had planned for Maddox to move all of his men to the southern side, taking her warning as truth. While I was still suspicious, I still believed Brittany deserved a chance to clear her name. The scent of drying blood set my teeth on edge as I allowed my fingers to graze my creamy skin. Beneath the thick layer of dried blood, my stomach was smooth and without injury. "Where is the wound, Lola?" Maddox had asked as the fighting finished and Giovanni was healed. Maya had recoiled from the thought, from the same realization I had, but it would change nothing. Even Maya couldn't deny what had happened. Turning my head from Alpha Maddox's gaze, I ran my tongue over the dried vampire blood on my lip and trembled at the taste. The vampire had been half human. I knew that, because as the blood hit my taste buds, strength and bliss shocked my nerve endings. I had been stunned into silence as the blood brought strength to my weary body, the wound in my stomach sewing itself back together. Most of the drive home I had been mulling over the price my father paid for Tristan's escape, and why he would agree to such a thing in the first place. What was so important about Tristan? While questions swam in my head, battering against my skull until a dull ache formed, only one of my questions was answered. Situated in front of the pack house, with her back against the door sat a girl I had thought about only a handful of times. Our only interaction had been before I knew the truth, when the vampires were sneaking onto our land. Jessie was positioned against the front door, her legs stretched out as though she were waiting for someone. Only she wasn't waiting. Her eyes were wide in fear, staring off into the distance. Her small hands were clutching her neck, and through them I could see the thick jagged line that nearly severed her head from her body. Just like with Adrian, there wasn't a drop of Jessie's blood on the ground. Chapter 80. Alpha Maddox mind-linked his beta, and the two of us waited by Jessie's body until he showed. With Jessie's lifeless face lingering in my mind, Maddox turned to face me. His honey eyes were hard as they regarded me, stress and exhaustion hidden beneath the surface. The Vampire King used her as payment, didn't he? Maddox asked, recognizing the pattern of DH. It seems he did. I frowned, my eyes lingering on the spot Jessie had once sat. This isn't your fault, Lola. Maya murmured, you aren't responsible for everyone. I wasn't sure she knew about her heritage, and I never had the chance to explain. I had long stopped trying to understand the shadows and why they demand such payments, but I couldn't see the point in KG another half-blood. Jessie was just a child, born into a world where species are at war, and collateral damage is high. Why? Maddox grimaced, anger flaring in his dark eyes. She was like me. I stated simply, turning my face away as his intense eyes searched for my own. Not the same bloodline, but she was a half-blood. How long have you known this? Maddox asked, his voice dark. Not long. I shook my head, I met her when the attacks were happening. We could both smell the vampires though neither of us knew where the scent was coming from. And this is an indication of her species? Maddox asked, his voice taking on an impatient tone. I brushed the anger in his voice off, knowing we both endured a very long night. I wondered if either of us would manage to achieve any sleep. With my birthday 2 days away and a war between species looming over my head, I needed all the sleep I could manage. You can't tell Brianna any of this. I sighed, knowing her mom would kill the two of us if she found out we read her private collection of books. Brianna's mom has a secret stash of books. We broke into her safe and read them. According to the books, vampires' scents are nearly undetectable. The scent is undetectable, unless you're a vampire. Undetectable? Maddox questioned, his eyes were captivated as I continued speaking. They smell sweet like, really sweet. I grimaced as the smell ebbed to the front of my memory. Jessie could smell them too. Then, I suppose the shadows asked for the life of a half-blood. Maddox frowned, though he hadn't KD her himself. Maybe the shadows have a preference. I shrugged, though a nagging feeling remained in my gut. I'm no closer to figuring them out than I was a month ago. I'm not sure I want you to figure them out. Maddox murmured to himself, each of us sharing a look of uncertain concern. We need to talk to Brittany, don't we? I sighed, knowing this night wasn't through yet. We do. Maddox nodded, though I would prefer to speak with her sooner rather than later. I know. I frowned. I think I should speak with Tyler. Even locked in a cell, I cannot stand the thought of him under the same roof as you. Maddox growled lowly, exhaling sharply as we entered the house. Alpha Bran had made it back to the pack house before us, and was slumped on the living room couch. A thin trail of blood ran the length of his face, along with a wound on his arm. The pristine couch in the living room was flecked with blood, but neither Alpha seemed to care. One of the fking vermin bit me. Alpha Bran snapped, holding his arm up to showcase the wound. Bit me like I'm a fking sausage. Did you make him regret it? I found myself asking, a dry smile on my face as I looked at the Alpha I had once beat. I did, my dear. Alpha Bran returned my grim smile with one of his own. His remains are scattered throughout the forest. And what of Alpha Zeke? Maddox questioned, his eyes flashing at Bran with annoyance. Tending to his men. Alpha Bran grunted. The putrid smell was far from mine as we walked down into the dungeons. While my nose wrinkled at the scent, my stomach no longer turned itself into knots. I had seen enough blood to last a lifetime. A putrid stench was nothing compared to that. Reluctantly, Maddox took the left tunnel where Brittany resided and I took the right. Unable to leave Brittany and Tyler unguarded, Maddox had left 2 men each to guard their cells. Isaac and one of Maddox's men guarded Tyler's cell. It was almost humorous to see Tyler's once best friend guarding his cell, though Isaac's eyes held no fondness for his old friend. Lola. Isaac nodded, his eyes hard as he glanced at Tyler's slumped figure. I wanted to apologize about before. No need. I shook my head, dismissing his apology with a wave. I had long ago moved on from Tyler. The more I thought about my relationship with Tyler, the more I realized how much I had truly changed. The girl who dated Tyler was the shallow daughter of a beta. She didn't care for pack politics or a war between species. Even though it had only been a year ago, it felt like another lifetime. Trying to get in her pants already, Isaac? Tyler snorted, his voice rough from lack of water. Get in line, though I'm not sure you can compete with an alpha or vampire. Isaac didn't react to Tyler's bait, clearly used to it at this point. I rolled my eyes at Tyler and watched as he pulled himself from the earthen wall. He was looking much more haggard than yesterday, his hair a couple shades darker from a thick coating of dirt. I assume there's a reason behind your visit. Tyler smirked, having the gall to act smug while he rotted in a silver cage. Are things not going so well with your new alpha? The bitterness in Tyler's words fell on my ears, and part of me wanted to laugh. While a war between our species must have been brewing for quite some time, it was Tyler that lit the match and watched everything go up in flames. Had Tyler truly expected everything to work out in his favor? Yes, because his pride clouds his mind. Maya murmured. Let's play a game, shall we? Tyler chuckled, though his laughter was a shell of what it used to be. A question for a question. Very well. I nodded, remaining cautious in case Tyler had something up his sleeve. Are you worried, Lola? Tyler spoke lowly, his eyes ablaze with hidden emotion. I assume your birthday is coming up any day now. Whoever could your mate be? That's 2 questions. I rolled my eyes. And of course, I'm worried. Did you know about the AK tonight? Tonight? Tyler's eyes were bright, almost hopeful. I knew they were planning an AK, but I hadn't a clue when or where it would happen. How far did they get? I couldn't see the harm in answering his question, so I obliged. Not far. I shrugged, they headed to my dad's house. It seems they were looking for me. I watched in silence as some of the light in Tyler's eyes diminished. I realized, Tyler was hoping the vampires would rescue him. He had nothing for them, nothing to benefit their cause of the complete destruction of all werewolves. They wouldn't come for Tyler, and now he was beginning to believe it. Is Brittany in on this? I asked, watching Tyler's expression carefully. Irritation flooded my veins as an ear-splitting grin formed on Tyler's face. A deep, raspy chuckle emerged from his chest while his eyes were bright with amusement. You're desperate for this answer, I can see it in your eyes. Tyler snickered, perhaps she is but maybe she isn't. Enough, cut the bull **T. I snapped, pinching the bridge of my nose as I exhaled slowly. As I opened my eyes, Tyler's grin had only widened. How interesting. Tyler chuckled, if I told you she was in fact working with the vampires, your alpha would kill her, but I could be lying. Could you handle that, Lola? Could you live with yourself knowing your precious alpha tortured and MD an innocent girl? I knew this conversation was pointless when Tyler erupted into unhinged laughter. His time in Maddox's dungeons had muddled his mind, or perhaps he had always been this way. There was one other option, one I had refused to think about until we were left empty-handed. I could use the one-sided bond between Tristan and I to find out the truth. If Brittany was working with the vampires, Tristan would know. For once, Maya begrudgingly accepted my alternative plan. Maddox and I were silent as we retreated up to our bedroom. Once the door closed softly, he turned to face me. I could see the exhaustion etched onto his gorgeous face, the corners of his full lips were turned down. His eyes were clouded, filled with emotion that knotted my stomach. If anyone were to look closely, they would see the truth behind Alpha Maddox. Rumored to be ruthless and cruel, Maddox had a limitless love for his pack and people. There was nothing he wouldn't do for his pack, nothing he wouldn't sacrifice. Did she say anything? I found myself asking, holding myself back from running into his arms. She cried, a lot. Maddox sighed, running a hand through his already messy hair. I had to resort to some unsavory methods to ensure she wasn't lying. And was she? I leaned in, my heart hammering for some unknown reason. She claims to have no idea the vampires changed their plans. Maddox murmured thoughtfully, yet a shred of suspicion lingered within him. You're not going to like this, but it's something I need to do. I grimaced at how weak my own voice sounded. I'm going to use the bond between Tristan and I to visit him. I'll do everything I can to uncover the traitors in this pack. Maddox's honey eyes turned dark in seconds, flashing in anger as he stalked over to me. Before his lips parted, I knew what he was going to say. There wasn't a chance he would willingly allow me to do this, but I didn't care. I continued speaking before he had the chance to utter a single word. This is my pack too, Maddox. Sean could have died tonight. My dad, my grandma both could have died tonight. I frowned, remembering the fear I felt when my dad ran from the house. If she is innocent, I won't let Brittany suffer. I have one condition. Maddox murmured darkly, lingering anger continued to swim in his obsidian eyes. If he touches you, moves towards you, or breathes too closely, you will come right back. I will, I promise. I nodded, and I truly meant it. The part of me that longed for Tristan was much easier to control now, and I knew I wouldn't be caught off guard by him again. Surprise jolted me as Maddox wrapped his arms around my waist, holding me to his chest tightly. The quickened pace of his heart matched my own and calmed some of the raging storm within me. His dark eyes were consuming, heating my skin as they roamed my face slowly. His hot breath fanned across my lips, and my body leaned in on its own accord. Every nerve ending erupted in little explosions at the short distance between us. All this time with Maddox, and I hadn't asked the obvious question in fear of the answer. Unknowingly, I had given this man my entire heart and was unsure if I owned his in return. The fear that crippled me spurred my decision. Confusion fluttered in the depths of his dark eyes as I turned my head away from his own. Maddox, what do you feel for me? I found myself asking, looking into the depths of his eyes as though they held the answer. I had held back asking these questions, knowing I would be destroyed if the answer wasn't what I expected. I had shoved those burning questions away, content to live in bliss with Maddox. What do I feel for you? He murmured, those intoxicating eyes burning into my own. Why have you waited so long to ask me this? I was afraid. I grimaced, clearing my throat in a poor attempt to strengthen my voice. A fool could hear how fragile my words were, how everything hinged on Maddox's response. I'm still afraid. I find you intriguing, intoxicating, and utterly irresistible. Maddox purred, his hand tracing lazy circles across my lower back. I think about you so often. I moved you into my house and bedroom. And how do you feel about me, Lola? Those 3 words hovered on my tongue, sweet like honey as it awoke in my taste buds. I couldn't bring myself to utter those words, not without knowing for sure. Am I your mate? Those 4 words hovered in the air between us, and as the seconds ticked by, my heart cracked painfully. Maddox's eyes gave nothing away, not a single emotion as he weighed my words on his tongue. Even as my heart threatened to split in 2, I couldn't bring myself to regret asking the question. My patience had finally run thin, and I couldn't stand waiting the 2 days until my birthday. Maddox's words were slow and measured, as though he spent a considerable amount of time thinking over his response. He had gone over this conversation in his head hundreds of times, waiting until I was brave enough to ask the question. I know how I feel about you. Maddox murmured, his hand rough as it trailed along my cheek. The moment I met you, I was drawn in. My parents told me many times what the mate bond feels like, and yet this is different. Different. The word stung my skin, like a blade against soft flesh. I understood more once I learned you were half vampire. Maddox murmured, capturing my attention of his hand. Vampires are able to pick their own mates, yet werewolves cannot. You are a mix of both. While I feel drawn to you, how are we to know you cannot just pick a mate as you please? Something inside of me ached as I understood the reason behind Maddox's restraint. He hadn't given that part of himself over to me in fear I wouldn't choose him, as if anyone else stood a chance. You think I might be able to choose my own mate? I asked. The thought had never occurred to me before, but sent a jolt of panic down my spine. This was a good thing, right? Yet, I felt no relief. If I were able to choose my own mate, that meant Maddox had a mate in the world, and she wasn't me. I had knowingly gotten involved with another alpha, one whose mate was possibly someone other than myself. I had promised I would never go through this again, and yet I couldn't seem to resist Maddox. What if you're wrong? I questioned, holding his gaze as I silently pleaded with the moon goddess. What if you're my mate? If you're my mate, I'd consider myself the luckiest alpha in the world and will not hesitate to remove that vampire's mark from your skin. Maddox purred, drawing me into his arms once more. His thick fingers trailed over my back, and I couldn't hold in the jagged sigh that left my lips. Despite the renewed anticipation I felt for my birthday, the knot encompassing my heart had finally begun to unravel. Chapter 81. I laid awake until Maddox's breathing grew heavy, slowing as he fell asleep. With his arms wrapped around me, and the heat from his body warming my bones, I closed my eyes and thought of Tristan. It was harder than I expected, tapping into that sliver of myself, the part of me that longed for Tristan. Hour after hour passed as I stared at the backs of my eyelids, until a tugging sensation formed in my gut. Instead of fighting the intrusive feeling, I allowed myself to be pulled away. The world around me faded into black until my surroundings changed completely. This room was different from the one I had previously met Tristan in. The walls were rough as if the room itself were carved from stone. A plush bed sat in the middle of the room, large enough for 4 people to sleep comfortably. A Persian rug sat across the tiled floor, golden whorls and shapes glittered on its surface. Across the room sat a gilded fireplace, the edges were etched in gold, reflecting light as the fire within blazed merrily. In front of the fireplace sat a long couch, deep maroon in color. As my eyes wandered over every feature of the room, I nearly missed the figure sitting on the couch. I circled around the couch and faced Tristan. His blonde hair looked gold as it attracted light from the blazing fire. His hands were clasped tightly, anger burning in his gaze as he stared into the hungry flames. I watched in silence as he noticed me, the anger replaced itself with amused interest. "Well, hello beautiful," Tristan purred, leaning back on the couch as his eyes roamed me lazily. I ignored the tingling of my scarlet mark and gave Tristan a hard look. I could still see the remnants of anger burning in his eyes, though he tried to conceal it with a sly grin. "Rough night?" I asked, my eyes probing the depths of his own. Tristan hid his irritation skillfully, a look of mock offense forming on his face. "Clearly." He scoffed, but continued eyeing up my legs. "Though, you could drastically change that." "Don't count on it." I snorted, "Does it hurt? To know one of your own betrayed you for the love of a she-wolf?" "Hurt?" Tristan mused, his eyebrow cocked. "It does not hurt." "Is it a horrible inconvenience?" "Yes." "Regardless, Giovanni will be dealt with in time." "If you say so." I shrugged, schooling my face into a mask of indifference. "Giovanni's loyalty will be useful. I can't wait to hear what he knows." "My dear, you believe you are the only ones who have spies." The corners of Tristan's lips twitched, his eyes playful and amused. "Really?" I chuckled, shaking my head in disbelief. "I highly doubt your spies would get past Alpha Maddox for long." "You think too highly of your Alpha." Tristan chuckled, his ocean eyes burning into my own. "Though, I'll let you find out for yourself." "Is Brittany one of those spies?" I mused, paying close attention to the emotion burning in his eyes. Whether Tristan had anticipated my question or not, his eyes revealed nothing. His lips twitched into a smile, one that sent irritation flooding my veins. "Brittany?" Tristan smirked, "The mate of your prior boyfriend. You know who I'm talking about." I rolled my eyes, his smirk widening. "Is she a spy? And why should I give you anything, beautiful?" Tristan asked, "You have given me nothing in return." "What do you want?" I asked, my eyebrow raised as I anticipated his response. "You." Tristan shrugged, flashing me a predatory grin. "Yeah, that's not going to happen." I shook my head. A headache danced around my temples, and I wondered how that was possible. Tristan's eyes trailed over my body, and yet he made no move to approach me. His eyes flickered from my own to the far wall, lingering on the clock for just a few moments. When his eyes met my own, a joyful grin formed on his face. "I suppose it would do no harm to tell you now." Tristan shrugged, "By the time you wake up, it will be too late." "Tell me what?" I asked, wondering if he could hear the affect his words had on my heart. Brittany is much more than meets the eye. Tristan smirked, she is quite the mastermind. Your Alpha suspected, and yet she remained alive. Such a shame, the consequences won't be pleasant. My stomach dropped as his words settled in my mind, each word piercing my skin like shards of glass. Tyler could have avoided all of this and told me himself, but he continued playing games. I wasn't sure what Tristan meant when he said it would be too late, but I couldn't risk staying around any longer. Goodbye, beautiful. Tristan purred, until we meet again. The connection between the two of us snapped like a thin sheet of glass, shattering to the floor as I awoke in bed. The sun was beginning to rise, casting hues of gold along the damp earth. Stray beams of light ebbed through the CS, though the room was still cloaked in darkness. I pulled myself from bed and quietly slipped on some clothes, noting how calm Maddox's breathing sounded. The entire house was silent, and I saw no point in needlessly waking Maddox up. I tiptoed downstairs, shuddering at how dark and eerie the house felt at night. I headed down to the basement, feeling the overwhelming need to check on Brittany and Tyler. Tristan's words had embedded themselves under my skin, filling me with a sense of dread and paranoia. As I made it down to the basement, I nearly screamed as Luna Freya emerged from the dark dungeon tunnel. Surprise flooded her eyes as she placed a hand against her heart. Lola, you nearly gave me a heart *K. Luna Freya exhaled sharply, humor dancing in her eyes. Same here. I nodded, letting out a breathless chuckle. What are you doing down here? I needed to check on Brittany. Luna Freya frowned, concern etched onto her face. I understand Alpha Maddox is suspicious after the AK last night, and I allowed him to question her, but I needed to make sure she was all right. I wondered what unsavory methods Maddox had resorted to in order to get answers from Brittany, though I couldn't blame him. Holding the title of Alpha wasn't an easy job, especially when you looked over the largest pack in the world. Sometimes cruelty and ruthlessness were required, though I had seen many sides of Maddox. I understand. I grimaced, and for a moment I wondered why I had come down here in the first place. How is she? My words caught in my throat as the dark stain on Luna Freya's jacket made itself known. Deep in color, shining under the poor basement lights. The blood on her jacket was still wet, though her skin was free of blemishes or wounds. Every ounce of motherly concern drained from Luna Freya's face as she caught the location of my gaze. Something dark and feral crossed her eyes, and without hesitation, she lunged for my throat. I had just enough time to scramble backwards, knocking into a stack of boxes. I grunted as something hard slammed into my head, but remained focused on Luna Freya. I steadied myself as the boxes crashed to the floor, and I hoped the noise had woken the entire house. Maddox! I shouted through the mind link, Maddox, wake up! Her canines were lengthened, her claws elongated as she lunged again. Her claws scraped against the skin on my stomach, but I rolled to the side with seconds to spare. Warm blood seeped into my t-shirt, but I couldn't waste the time to assess the damage. It was clear from the way Luna Freya moved, that she had extensive experience in fighting. Her movements were graceful, calculated, and precise. She wasn't toying with her prey, as most werewolves do, she was heading straight for the KL. Her speed was half of my own, though it was my speed that kept me alive. Lola. His voice was faint due to the roaring in my ears. My head throbbed in time to my quickening heartbeat. KG Luna Freya was the last thing I wanted, but I knew she wouldn't let me leave this basement alive. From the look of primal determination on her face, I knew Maddox would never get answers from her. I felt my own claws emerge and watched as she failed to defend her left side. With a slim chance of survival, I lunged at her. A snarl of fury left her lips as my claws sunk into her sides, and my canines met her throat. I was greeted by the thick taste of her blood. Rich and decadent like dark chocolate, I struggled to pull myself from her body. Her claws scraped at my skin, but my grip on her was ironclad. I could no longer feel the stinging pain as her claws raked into my flesh. Instead of pain, her claws felt like gentle caresses. I wanted to be repulsed, but everything within me praised the blood. It ignited my cells, shocking my nerve endings as I became bloated with strength. Maya remained silent, speechless as she watched the other side of me make itself known. As much as Maya wanted to be angry, she knew what I was, and accepted me regardless. Lola. Maddox's voice was a beacon that pulled me away, pulling my attention from Luna Freya's blood. I forced myself away from Luna Freya's body, unable to pull my eyes from her frozen corpse. Her face was contorted in rage, her claws still lengthened. Her blood coated my mouth, and I resisted the animalistic urge to lick every last drop. I couldn't force myself to meet Maddox's eyes, convinced this would change everything between us. How could he care for a monster? Would he even want me as a mate after this? Large hands pulled me from the floor, setting me on my feet. My legs felt like jelly, but remained strong from the blood I had consumed. Maddox's hands toyed at the shredded shirt I wore, peeling it back to look at my stomach. Luna Freya's claws had slashed across my stomach, but there was no wound to be found. Maddox wiped away my blood with part of the shirt, running his fingers over my stomach slowly. Instead of a wound, there were 3 raised lines, thick and jagged. The wound alone would have KD'd me, and yet the blood healed them effortlessly. That's how you healed from the stab wound. Maddox spoke, though his voice held no animosity. I dared to look into his eyes, flinching at the softness within them. This would have KD'd you. My voice fell short, sputtering out as I realized I hadn't a clue what to say. When did you find out you craved blood? Maddox asked, cupping my chin as he forced me to stare into his eyes. I don't crave it. I winced at the word. When I taste it, I like it. I'm not some walking blood addict. How interesting. Maddox murmured, tearing the bottom of my shirt off and using it to wipe the blood from my lips. Interesting. I choked, glancing down at Luna Freya's body. I KD'd her, and drank her blood. It's disgusting. It's who you are. Maddox stated simply, unfazed by what just happened. Though, it seems you don't need blood to survive. You've gone 18 years without it. She's half vampire. Zeke's voice broke the trance between Maddox and I, as we both whipped around to meet his surprised face. Wearing nothing but loose-fitting sweatpants, it was clear Zeke had just woken up. His dark hair was a mess on his head, sticking up in random directions. She is. Maddox nodded slowly, his eyes locked on his friend. Though, I would appreciate if you kept the information to yourself. Alpha Bran is quite bloodthirsty when it comes to vampires. Much to my dismay, Zeke snorted at Maddox's terminology and flashed me an uneasy smile. Luna Freya. What happened? Zeke asked, both him and Maddox meeting my gaze. Might as well explain from the beginning. Maddox grunted. Well, a vampire marked me, so I have a constant connection to him until I find my mate. I visited him through the mark last night. I needed to know if Brittany was telling the truth, or if we had more than one traitor in this pack. He told me Brittany was a spy, but by the time I woke up, I'd be too late. I grimaced. I came down here just as Luna Freya was leaving the dungeons. She had blood on her clothes, fresh blood. When she saw I noticed, she attacked me. Lunafreya was a spy. Zeke scoffed, shaking his head as he stared down at her corpse. Anything else I need to know? My father is the Vampire King, so there's that. I sighed, wishing I could start this morning over. Alpha Zeke looked oddly at peace with the information I was handing him, though it could prove dangerous to myself. Zeke turned to Maddox, meeting his eyes with a hard stare. I only need to ask once. Do you trust her? Zeke asked Maddox, and I tried not to be offended by the question. Lola had the chance to let me d*e, and yet here I am. Maddox nodded, a soft smile on his face. I trust her with my life. Sorry. Zeke gave me a gentle smile. I had to ask. I'm a little offended, but I understand. I huffed, watching as Zeke's smile widened. We need to go down there. That blood on Lunafreya's jacket didn't belong to her. The three of us headed down to the dungeons, walking down the damp corridors as we approached the fork in the tunnels. I'm going to check on Tyler. I nodded to the two of them and turned on my heel. The scent of fresh blood mixed with the scent of old, both alluring and disgusting as it entered my nose. As I walked into the room where Tyler's cage sat, I noticed two bodies slumped to the floor. Isaac and one of Maddox's men lay lifeless on the ground, their eyes wide as though they were reliving the *K that cost them their life. Blood coated their throats and torsos, and I kneeled down to view the wound on their necks. The wound on their neck wasn't from the shadows, but from a werewolf's claws. Puckered and jagged, the wounds on their neck still glistened with blood. My heart ached for Isaac and the mate I knew he had, though I had never met her before. When I turned to face Tyler's cell, my jaw clattered to the floor. Strung against the wall like meat, Tyler's face was etched into a look of HR. His shirt had been torn from his body. A thick, jagged line spanned the length of his chest. The wound was gaping, showing the white of his ribcage. Sitting on the floor of his cell sat his heart, neatly carved from his chest. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.